This is TWiT.
You may or may not have heard about Google maybe or maybe not making some changes to the way it does or does not track you online. There's a lot to get into here with Google's FLoC. And joining us today is Issie Lapowsky of Protocol.com. Welcome, Issie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. So the kind of starter question that I have for you is, if you could please start by explaining what FLoC is. This is something that Google had announced a while ago, and I think that we could all use a bit of a refresher on FLoC before we get into what's changing.
Right. It's such a simple question. I wish it had a simple answer. But FLoC is basically part of Google's plan for killing off the third-party cookie, which it announced in response to the idea that, cookies are kind of creepy. They allow third parties to track all of the things that you do across the web on an individual basis. So Google said, you know what? We're going to change it, and we're going to replace cookies with something called FLoC, short for Federated Learning of Cohorts, which is really just the most catchy name. And what FLoC does essentially, or plan to do essentially, is rather than allowing a cookie to track you on an individual basis, your browser would more or less monitor your behavior and filter you into a cohort based on that behavior, and other users in that cohort would have demonstrated similar behavior. So publishers would then see your cohort ID. They wouldn't know what it stood for, but they would be able to target understanding that this cohort has some kind of similarity, right? Now, Google said this is a lot better than the cookie. This is, a lot more privacy protective because you don't know which individual is doing what. These cohorts are large enough that everybody kind of blends in with the crowd. But privacy advocates said not so. If I have, any sort of other identifying information about your browser, maybe because you logged in with a single sign-on type of tool, or maybe on Facebook and I have a lot of information about your interests, I can use these cohort IDs to sort of infer things about your interests and infer things about, furthermore, the other people in your cohort, even if I've never met them before, right? So there was a lot of concern that FLoC was not as private as Google was making it out to be. On the flip side, the ad industry was not thrilled with FLoC either, because they said, hey, wait a minute, Google, you're still going to have access to all of this data. You still own the browser. You can still see everything, and you are our competitor. So a lot of folks in the ad industry went crying to antitrust and competition regulators saying, Google's trying to hoard all the data for itself and cutting us out.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that kind of stood out there, whenever you were explaining FLoC, is that the browser is still doing all of that tracking, and so they get to see everything that's still happening. It's just what everybody else gets access to afterwards is obscured. That's correct?
Right. And so over the course of all of this backlash to FLoC, Google did make a series of commitments around, we will also use the data that we are providing to other, third-party ad tech firms. We'll also use that same data in our ad systems. The concern is, okay, but Google's a lot bigger than just an ad system. Yeah, that's a huge part of its business, but it's got a lot of other stuff going on, and all of that data is still absorbed by the monolith that is Google. Understood. So we kind of talked about the reaction at the time to FLoC, and with the privacy advocates on one hand and then the ad tech folks on the other hand, kind of both being unhappy. In response to this, Google said, okay, not FLoC, but let's introduce something new. Can you talk about that new thing and how this is supposed to be different from what FLoC was? Right. So Google killed off FLoC this week, which was kind of a long time coming. You could see that they were kind of changing their mind on it for a while. They replaced it with something called Topics. Topics is an API that will essentially look at your browsing behavior on an individual level, and it will filter that into topics that you're interested in. And these topics will be picked from, a few hundred topics, things like, fitness, very broad ideas. And then the Topics API will relay to publishers what topics you're interested in so they can serve ads based on those topics. Those topics will change out every few weeks. So they won't be static, and they'll basically lose importance over time. But they will allow advertisers to target you in a way that's based on your broader web browsing behavior. And so once again, this rings alarm bells for privacy folks, because they say, contextual advertising is great. Sending me a sports related ad because I'm on ESPN.com, all good. But there's no reason why some complete other website that has nothing to do with sports and that maybe I haven't even gone to before should know anything about my interest in sports. So that's really their concern. Meanwhile, Google is saying, hey, look, this is a lot better, because whereas FLoC was just kind of automatically generating these cohorts based on interests that were, potentially sensitive in nature, Topics is going to be really stripped down. It's going to be a human curated list of topics, so we don't get into a lot of that sensitive stuff. And it's better than what we have right now, which is cookies. So that's Google's argument. The privacy argument is a little bit different. But at least some privacy folks say this is better than FLoC.
Interesting. So there are some privacy advocates who are happier with Topics than they are with the original FLoC. I mean, because on the face of it, it's FLoC says we are going to look at your browsing history or we're going to look at your browsing activity, and then we're going to sort you into groups based on your browsing history or browsing activity. And then Topic says we're going to look at your browsing activity, and then we're going to sort you into groups based on your browsing activity. On the face of it, they don't sound too different, but privacy advocates are happier because of the human curation involved. Is that what kind of sets it apart? That it's these groups that are chosen based on an actual human being? And how does Google choose who that human being is? I know this is kind of a spur of the moment question, but I'm so curious about kind of that, how this is supposed to be better.
That's right. It's not one person deciding what these topics are. There is already a list. I believe it's 350 topics. I presume there are teams and teams and teams working on that list. And so privacy advocates say at least Topics makes it harder to do something called browser fingerprinting, which is when you haven't, I don't have exactly all of your information, but I can cobble together enough information to know it's your browser when I'm seeing your browser clicking on a certain website, right? There's another thing that we haven't talked about that I should have brought up in the first explanation of Topics, which is that Google has introduced some controls for users. So if you check your topics and you don't like that it has a topic related to, I don't know, your interest in fashion or whatever it might be, you can take that out. Now, that's nice, and user controls are better than not having user controls, but what's best is to offer privacy in the first place. So a lot of the folks that I talked to said, it would be better if people were opting in to having their topics inferred, rather than Google having this be the default state. And then, if I'm a really determined privacy hawk, I can go into my settings every 3 weeks and delete my topics that I don't want to be in there, right? Like that's kind of an impractical use case that most people who use the Chrome browser, which is most people, are not going to take advantage of.
Right. And that kind of becomes the argument, I think, for a lot of both privacy advocates and just tech folks in general is, sure, we put in all of these practices and these methods of trying to help people take control of their privacy. But a lot of times folks don't know what that means, how to go about doing that. I can remember article after article online showing you, here's what Facebook thinks about you. You can go to this page and learn what it thinks you do and are, and you can delete what you don't want. And I remember having to go and make a correction in Twitter because it kept trying to serve me foreign language options all the time. And I'm like, I don't speak another language. And it was because of something that I happened to click on. So it's interesting to see kind of how, for the most part, folks aren't too enthused about this new wave of things. But one thing that I am curious about, Google and wanting to sort of rid everyone of the third-party cookie, what is the big what is the big argument for why the third-party cookie is a bad idea? Why are we trying to look for something new instead of the third-party cookie? Just, a sort of a clarification on that.
Yeah, I think there's just an awakening about privacy. Why should a company I've never heard about, and most people have never heard of, all of these ad tech firms, be able to know exactly what I'm doing as I'm doing it all across the web and be able to share that information with other publishers? And it just becomes like this endless data spill that you don't know where to even begin to try to claw that back. And Google knows that. I think the public is getting hip to that. I think regulators are moving on that. So I think it's sort of like in the ether that Google knows it has a big role to play here.
Absolutely. Okay, my final question for you is just as a person who has paid attention to this in general and is looking at these different privacy concerns, do you think there's a solution that will make everyone happy? And if not, if you could sort of read the crystal ball, as it were, do you have any idea where you think Google might lean? Are they going to try to more satisfy privacy advocates and privacy concerns, or are they going to lean more towards satisfying ad networks, ad tech folks? Because an example, Apple mostly was okay with upsetting ad tech folks for the sake of user privacy. Google, came out with FLoC in the beginning, saw the issues there, and then came out with this idea. Are we going to see more iterations on this? And do you think Google will fall more toward one way or the other?
It's hard to say. I mean, what I think we can know for sure is that Google is going to protect the ad-sponsored internet at all costs. That is how it's made its, billions, trillions. So that's where Google's loyalty lies, right? And obviously it has a lot of wiggle room to impact the data that third parties can get, even as it continues to collect data. But more and more, it is facing a lot of scrutiny and pressure from antitrust regulators. And they're kind of at odds with the privacy folks, saying, well, wait a minute, Google, you're going to make the world more private, but in doing so, you're going to entrench your own market position? I don't know about that. And so, I think that Google is kind of in a tough spot right now. Is there a solution that is going to satisfy everybody? Absolutely not, because, an entire gigantic industry is on the line here. And the only thing that folks on the other side of that industry, the privacy advocates, will be satisfied with is the end of targeted advertising. And so I don't think you find a middle ground that really makes everyone happy.
Understood. Issie, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. If folks want to follow you online and check out all your great work, where can they go to do so?
They should go to protocol.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at Issie Lapowsky.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.